Benvenuti, signore e signori. Welcome, everybody. We just started slightly later because we all know how the rain in Rome brings the city to a halt. So apologies to those online who've been waiting a few minutes for the start. I'm really delighted to be welcoming you to tonight's Rushforth Lecture, which is generously sponsored by John Osborne and is dedicated to the memory of the British School at Rome's first director, the director from 1901 to 1903, Gordon Rushforth. Gordon Rushforth only stayed in Rome for a shortish period, seemingly because his health, the climate didn't agree with his health. And when he started to suffer from the climate, he went back to the wonderful climate of the United Kingdom. But he stayed long enough to establish the BSR on a very firm footing, as well as producing just a short 123-page article on the frescoes of the recently discovered Santa Maria Antiqua. So he wasn't resting on his laurels during his time here. Rushforth was a distinguished scholar. He had specialism in medieval studies, but also, as I found reading about him, in all kinds of other areas. He was interested in many things and went into detail. And he was described in the obituary in the Times as a man of wide-ranging learning and sympathies, distinguished diplomatic manners, and linguistic abilities. And I'm giving you that full quotation because I decided it was also a very apt description of our speaker tonight, Professor Chris Wickham. Do you see what I did there? A beautiful segue. So we're so pleased to be welcoming Chris back to the BSR tonight. He is also a distinguished scholar, one might say a field-defining medieval historian, former professor at the University of Oxford and Birmingham, and also, of course, a former director of the British School at Rome, my immediate predecessor, to whom I owe the warmest of warm thanks for steering the school so beautifully, calmly, expertly through a really difficult period following or still during the pandemic months, and then handing it over to me in the most graceful and civilized manner I could possibly have hoped for, and then being a wonderful support ever since. So we're hugely grateful to Chris, and it's lovely to be able to celebrate him by hearing from him. Chris has written a mere 16 books on Italy and Europe, including Framing the Early Middle Ages in 2005, Roma Medievale in 2013, The Donkey and the Boat in 2023, published in Italian as L'Asino e il Battello in 2024. I understand he's currently finishing his 17th monograph, which I think is frankly excessive at this point. A joke, of course. He's currently finishing a book called Le due facce del comune consolare, governare ed essere governati nell'Italia centro-settentrionale, which will be done by the early spring. So Chris is not resting on his laurels either. So tonight, Chris will be speaking on the fascinating topic you can see up here. How did peasants react to city government? Rome and Piacenza in the 12th century. The warmest welcome to Chris Wickham. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Abby. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be here with John Osborne as well. And so thank you, John, for setting this up. And I hope that you and all of you will find it interesting. We know quite a lot about how autonomous city communes formed in north-central Italy in the 12th century. That's to say Italy down to and including Rome, and about how they took on increasingly elaborate and self-conscious roles as time went on. But how they actually worked on the ground in the countryside, and how peasants experienced and reacted to the development of city power, that's to say, is much less clear. And it's hinted at in the historiography rather than directly faced. So I want to look at two quite different examples of city communal rule over the countryside and over the peasants who lived in it, who were the huge majority of the population of Italy, to see how this process of ruling worked. I mean, Rome, of course, as fits the Rushforth Lecture, but also Piacenza, because some of that city's rural actions when facing off against a neighbouring and enemy commune, Pavia, are extremely well documented as the result of a formal court case plus witnessing in 1184. This evidence throws into relief the degree to which Rome was an atypical city-state in the central Middle Ages. I mean, so was every other city. Among the 40-plus autonomous communes in 12th century northern and central Italy, of varying stages of institutional development. And what I say, for one, certainly can't be considered to be valid for the others. They're often really very different politically, socially, even though Italian cities were and are fairly close to each other and had close relationships, normally hostile ones, to their neighbours. But although Rome's development as a city in the 12th century was much more similar to that of other cities than had sometimes been thought until the last couple of decades, the fact remains that Rome was indeed distinct in some ways, and especially as regards its control over the countryside. And I want to develop that in the second half of this lecture. Right, the briefest political and economic background makes some aspects of Rome's situation clear. The Kingdom of Italy, covering Italy north of Rome and ruled rather distantly by German emperors after 962, collapsed as an institutional structure at the end of the 11th century in the context of civil war, leaving the cities of the centre north to fend for themselves, and also leaving local lords considerable scope for establishing their own territorial lordships, signorie territoriali, in the years around and after 1100. Now, I've argued elsewhere that city leaders, all from a militarized class of rich, but usually not super rich, landowners, did not initially regard themselves as doing anything radically new when they established themselves as annually rotating consuls of their newly autonomous cities. An understanding that communal government was very different from the imperial power of the past came slowly across a couple of generations. First in the port cities, Genoa and Pisa, and then in Lombardy and Emilia, the old royal heartland of the north, and then in the Veneto. However, most of them certainly knew it and had come to be proud of the newly established autonomy of their communes by the time Emperor Frederick Barbarossa came into Italy in the 1150s, intent on re-establishing direct imperial control over them and intent on extracting substantial taxes as well. He was initially successful, with a high point in his power in 1162 to 67, but the North Italian cities formed themselves into the Lombard League and fought him off across the next decade. A compromise peace was established in the German city of Constance in 1183, allowing the emperor to continue to be influential in the north, but without keeping much direct power. But even that reduced role ended when Frederick and his son both died in the 1190s, leaving an imperial power vacuum which no later external ruler managed to reverse, although they tried. Cities were after that on their own, with many challenges, including fighting rival cities, and also what's most relevant here, the problem of how to establish power over their own rural hinterland, their contado, which in northern Italy was usually their diocese, a bit less so central Italy. Contadi were not automatically under city control from the start. Local territorial lordships, signorie territoriali, with judicial and military powers needed to be incorporated into city authority, and rural communes dominated by peasants and very small lords were beginning to crystallize by the mid-12th century as well, and rival cities might try to nibble at the boundaries of city territories too. We'll see how Piacenza responds to this in a moment. Now, Rome, not part of the Kingdom of Italy, ruled by popes, obviously, but the papacy as well faced a severe crisis in the civil wars around 1100. They were re-establishing themselves in the 1120s to 40s, and more or less as a direct reaction to that, Rome as a commune exploded onto the scene in 1143 to 4 in an uprising against the power of Pope Innocent II and his successors. The very aggressive self-consciousness of Rome as a commune right from the start showed a clear understanding by Rome's political leaders, who were less aristocratic than most of those in the north, of what city communes were by now doing elsewhere. Although Rome, which saw itself as special, chose to call its new secular rulers senators instead of consuls. The Roman commune was particularly independent of papal power in the second half of the 12th century, when popes were not usually in Rome, until in 1188, Clement III made peace with the commune and returned. After that, there were in effect two systems of government in the city, not one, as is clear in our documents for court cases, which could be sent to the tribunals of either the commune or the pope, according to the decisions of litigants. These patterns had some parallels in the centre north, where bishops had substantial power as well, but that power is reducing in the late 12th century, and especially in the 13th, whereas in Rome, papal power tended to increase again, especially around 1200 and onwards. But both the Pope and the Senate were the city in the eyes of their immediate neighbours, whether peasants or local military and seigneurial elites. But what's not similar to northern city communes was the Roman commune's rural hinterland. Northern cities had very fragmented landowning across their contadi, in which individual villages and small urban centres usually had many landowners inside each of them, extending from peasant owners to substantial lords. Rome is quite different from this. The whole large area around the city, about 40 kilometres across, is entirely owned by city landowners, almost always churches, who and they rented it out in large blocks, estates which were called after 1200 casali, to lay figures who were citizens as well. This area, the Agro Romano, we call it, they didn't, was already nearly half the size of the whole diocese or contado of Piacenza, itself quite large by northern standards. And it was always wholly controlled by city owners. Here, there are no signorie territoriali and hardly even any villages. Peasant cultivators lived scattered across the estate units. Then, also ruled by the city, was another larger territory extending across pretty much the whole of this map, from beyond Sutri down to Palestrina and down to Terracina, which is not on the map. I'll come back to that. That's more similar to the contadi of northern Italy, but much larger. And then beyond that, extending into modern Lazio, almost the whole of modern Lazio, up into southern Umbria, was a network of small cities and fortified villages, castelli, which had established their own autonomy in the 11th century, but they were very seldom capable of defending that autonomy against a strong Roman commune and a resurgent papacy after the late 12th century. Main exception there is Viterbo. So that the city's potential and soon actual area of authority was several times the size of that of any North Italian commune. But conversely, in that wider hinterland, the lords of Castelli, in particular, the group called barons, rapidly rising city territories with dozens of castelli each, established networks in the 13th century of rural lordships, which are far stronger than anything in the centre north. So rural challenges are quite different for Rome, even though the development of the city commune itself has many similarities to those in the north. And that difference is going to underlie everything I say about Rome later, after I've talked about Piacenza. So first Piacenza and the problem of its countryside. Your consuls, you developed a set of judicial practices which are regularizing themselves into institutions in the 1130s. You know how to govern your city, and your rule is accepted there. And you certainly know how to make war on rival cities, which began as soon as the kingdom fell apart and was routine year by year, also by the 1130s. And eventually, by 1183, you and your allies have also forced the German emperor not to interfere too much in your affairs. But how does your rule, how far does your rule extend in your city's contado? And how do you make it effective? Now, there are two issues here. I've mentioned both of them, but it's worth stressing. First, rival cities. In the case of Piacenza, it's Pavia on one side, Parma on the other. They fought wars with you on the boundaries of your diocese, your contado, with border castles and villages routinely taken or destroyed. And the second, usually more serious, were the autonomous lordships in the countryside, whether strong or weak, which routinely involved the same sort of exercise by lords of the judicial and fiscal rights, which cities are claiming elsewhere. And in this environment, urban government is by no means universal. Now, this fact is far from unknown. There's a substantial literature, a huge literature, on the conquista del contado, largely taking Florence as a model, as that city subjected rural lords by violence, castle by castle, taking a century and a half to do so. But it's not just about war, and in fact, it mostly wasn't. For a start, many rural lords are in reality urban living, which makes their commitment to autonomy often half-hearted, because it seems to powerful city dwellers as attractive to participate in ruling a city which had wide powers as it was to control one's own small rural power base oneself. And anyway, many lords are also urban ecclesiastics, bishops, abbots, abbesses of urban monasteries, city-based by definition. Now, sometimes, it's true, communes did think it best to impose their power in the countryside by violence, as when the city of Florence attacked seigneurial castles. Other examples of that are less forceful, even if entirely one-sided, as when, concerning the small village of San Marzano on the border between Pavia and Piacenza, subject to the signoria of the monastery of San Sepolcro of Pavia, we have an account of the abbot appearing one day in 1163-4, accompanied by the consuls of the city. And he says to the villagers, and I'm sure with very little enthusiasm, quote, "You cannot stay as you stayed up to now," unquote, and that henceforth the city would control the village and not him. But that's a village contested between Pavia and Piacenza, as we'll see in a moment. In fact, both city communes and local lords wanted quite often, at least when it came to standoffs, which could not so easily be resolved by force, to establish their rights by going to law or arbitration and by presenting evidence, which was almost always witnessing, as legal documents seldom provided the evidence that you needed. And these witness depositions could be very numerous and detailed. They're from city officials, consuls or their enforcers, but usually in a majority, they're the inhabitants of the countryside, very largely peasants, witnessing as to how ruling was carried out. And what they show us, beyond their incidental detail, which is fascinating in itself, is two crucial things. First, it mattered to political powers what peasants thought about who their rightful lords were. And second, that we therefore have some idea about what peasants thought the proofs of legitimate lordship and government were, whether seigneurial or communal. We've got the peasant voice, or at least the male peasant voice, almost no women here, telling us about what power consisted of. Now, there are various ifs and buts about witnessing, but essentially, there's something that you can get at here. So we've got at least some aspect both to how ruling actually worked and what it felt like from the standpoint of the ruled, what villagers, mostly peasants, thought about what urban government consisted of, how it was established, how it worked, what made it legitimate. And that gives us a different perspective on government to the city's eye view, which is dominant in the historiography. Now, the Pavia-Piacenza dispute of 1184 is the basis of what I'm going to say about Piacenza. It's a huge case. I can't even summarize it. The surviving testimony by 80 witnesses runs to 120 pages in small font in the published edition, but it's enough to give a survey of some of its main elements. The case is over 5 small villages, not very important, on the boundary between Pavia and Piacenza. Quite a small part of that boundary also. Monticelli, Pieve Parpanese, Olmo, San Marzano, and Mondonico. Each of them only a couple of kilometers apart, as you can see, set north and south of 2 important strategic castles, Olubra and Fontana, which were certainly Piacenza's. The witnessing concerned the last 30 years, few people remembered longer, which was also exactly the period of the Barbarossa Wars. It's called the Emperor's War, the Guerra Imperatoris, in the witnessing. And these villages had the ill luck to be near a major road running along the Po, which armies used routinely. Each of the 5 was burned more than once by these armies, in one case 3 times, which gave a decided edge to the accounts of the witnesses. They routinely dated events by individual campaigns, as well as by the consuls of the year in the 2 cities. But the wars also provided added issues to discuss. Routine questions included, which city did you flee to in times of war? A sign of felt identity. Most people said Pavia, though not all. Which army burned your village? The implication being here that if an imperial army did it, which it would include troops from Pavia, then the village was considered to be part of Piacenza's territory. Whereas an army from the Lombard League, which included Piacenza, would imply the opposite. Though I have to say these implications were not at all accurate because armies burned villages anyway. Now, that Piacenza and Pavia were almost always on opposing sides of a wider war, of course, made the situation worse. But the 2 cities had chosen to come to terms peacefully here by arbitration in the first year after the Peace of Constance in 1183. We don't have the arbitration, unfortunately, but it wouldn't have resolved the issue. The villagers changed sides more than once thereafter. But for our purposes anyway, the witnessing is more important. It shows what happened in practice, who was actually in the right, who knows, was contested locally. And it's effectively invisible, it doesn't really matter. But broadly, Mondonico is the most pro-Piacenza village, whereas San Marzano is the most hostile to periods of Piacenza's domination. Witnesses of the other 3 tend to Pavia, but they're more matter of fact. The witnessing is divided between pro-Pavia and pro-Piacenza witnesses, but those from the villages themselves, which are a majority, said very much the same things on both sides, which helps our confidence in the main lines of their claims, even when they disagreed, and doubtless lied on occasion or misremembered. The proofs of rule which the witnesses were asked about and described were fairly consistent. The consuls of Pavia or Piacenza each could raise the annually changing consuls of the local rural commune of each village, which meant choosing or ratifying them and making them swear loyalty to the city and its laws. It's a formal, largely symbolic process, but of highly important symbolism. They also taxed the villages, a tax on heads of cattle called juvaticum or bovateria, more occasionally an originally royal half tax, the fodrum, dues on the movement of goods and on mills. They control high justice, leaving lesser justice to rural consuls, although in fact there are plenty of references to quite small-scale individual cases between villagers being heard in the cities as well. They demanded labour service to build local castles and the canals and moats around cities, and some, although not actually all that much, army service, largely of archers. It's interesting, though, that the witnesses mention no one actually dying in the wars, even when villagers are sacked, except in one case, a consul of Piacenza, Guglielmo di Malovicino, whose death on campaign in 1172 is referred to many times as a significant event. Then, in a particularly bad year for harvest, probably 1176, when export of grain outside city territories was forbidden, the cities provided grain rations for country dwellers who came to collect it in the city. Now, these are the typical elements of city government in this period. You can see them in documents elsewhere. They're listed in the textbooks. A bit they're listed. But the way they're talked about is the key here. And so I want to talk about consuls and tax and justice. First of all, raising consuls. Broadly, Pavia is said to have raised consuls in the villages without opposition, quiete, quietly, as many witnesses said, in most of the villages in the 1160s and early 1170s. But after Barbarossa's failed siege of Alessandria in 1175, when the war turned against him and his ally, Pavia, the situation changed. One witness said simply that the Pavesi had maiorem vim, more force, before 1175, and the Piacentini had it after. But the Piacentini had certainly made inroads before that. In either 1160 or 1168, witnesses disagreed, Guglielmo di Mallavicino, then consul of Piacenza, appeared in Pieve Parpanese and demanded that the inhabitants swear to stare in precepto Placentiae, to keep to Piacenza's commands. They refused, saying that they were Pavesi. And then two witnesses said, they replied, there is no city which is accustomed to raise consuls here, because the villagers had done it themselves previously. So Guglielmo insulted them, hit one of them with his consular baton, must have been quite a big baton, and then they were scared and agreed to swear by force, per vim. The next year, they defied Piacenza and expelled the consuls of Piacenza who'd come to raise the local consuls, but the city leaders returned with armed men and they gave in again. Now, this Guglielmo di Mallavicino story with the baton is repeated in nearly identical terms by witnesses from San Marzano. So either it's now a generic legend about this guy, or else he'd actually chosen to do the same thing in different villages. Almost every village, however, had a narrative which involved the consuls of Piacenza making steady inroads into the process of raising local consuls, particularly in the previous 5 to 10 years, after 1175 or 1180, by force. Many witnesses said that the two cities in this recent period had raised consuls in the villages competitively. They meant by this that consuls and other officials of both cities came yearly and raised the village consuls. Several witnesses, however, then made it clear what this meant was that in the last 4 or 5 years, Piacenza had come second and had forced the local consuls chosen by Pavia to stand down, again by force, per vim. Conversely, the witnesses from Mondonico, who were more sympathetic to Piacenza, tended to claim that it's Pavia who first raised consuls by force there around 1161. Now, it's clear from all of this that a good deal of weight was placed on force. The phrase per vim is intended to mean, in these witnessings, illegitimately. But force is a double-edged weapon in this period. Force that was not opposed was regarded by 12th century Italians, including judges and arbiters, as a proof of right. If you forced a rival off contested land, and they didn't fight back or at once appeal to a court, you had a prima facie right to the property. If you forced a consul to swear to you and they let you, then you had more right to do it again. So when in the 1160s Pavia swore in consuls quiete, the word quietly is doing a good deal of work. Witnesses sometimes named powerful people from Piacenza who stood by and let them do so. Conversely, when Piacenza forced locals to swear to the city and deposed consuls who did not, and Pavia let them do so, it's Pavia who loses both legal ground and local consensus, which has legal weight as well. And that's also where some of the more subtly undermining stories have power. As when witnesses said that in Mondonico in the early 1180s, a consul of Pavia trying to challenge Piacenza there simply found 2 men in a field taking wine barrels down to the Po and swore them in as local consuls on the spot by force until the Piacentini made them resign. So there's an image of randomness here and failed randomness as well, which was intention. So broadly, it's certainly the case that Pavia had the worst of it in recent years. An elite witness from Pavia admitted that recently the villagers obeyed Piacenza more, but would rather obey Pavia if the latter could defend them. Obviously, it couldn't. But there's one thing that's abundantly clear here. There was no settled practice at any point in the 30 years before 1184 in the raising of local consuls in any of these places. And that the absence of settled practice meant that both cities had to try harder. Now, in most cases, as a consul, you sent a representative, here usually called a nuncius, a messenger, to do the city's work in localities. It's not only unnecessary to go yourself, But it's impossible. Otherwise, you'd spend the entire year going from village to village, installing and swearing in the consuls of all the rural communes of a contado when you've got other ruling to do. The fact that consuls of each city themselves appear in these small villages in so many of these accounts is a marker of the difficulty each city had in getting their position accepted. That's partially because the villages are on a contested frontier, but it's also a sign of the wider need for cities to build up consensus everywhere in the countryside before power could be routinized, which is evidently a process which here had only really even started in the 1160s. And until power is routinized, it's a lot more work. I'll come back to that. Now, taxes. Now, actually, usually cities collected taxes when they installed local consuls. So the history of taxation has got a similar storyline to that I just set out, similar set of assumptions about the legal role of force. More ambiguous, however, are the occasions in the early 1180s when both cities collected the bovateria tax from the same villages. But the Pavesi then gave it back, saying it wasn't fair to collect tax twice. Now, is that a claim that the city did have rights in the village? Or is it only a demonstration that it couldn't enforce them? One peasant witness clearly thought the latter, and he probably wasn't alone. But I think the point that's most useful to make here about the long accounts of tax paying in the witnessing is the role of pledges in them. Taxes were exacted in fixed and predictable sums of money, not necessarily large sums. But it's frequent for Piacenza in particular to send men to take pledges for future payment of tax from villages. These pledges had force because they were characteristically of far higher value than the actual tax due. A sword taken in pledge for 6 denarii, 10 solidi taken in pledge for 1 solidus. And you can see they're also random. And what they actually meant was that the armed men of Piacenza came and took what they chose from you, and then you had to traipse off to the city to pay your tax in order to get the goods back. If indeed you managed that. Sometimes the people managed, sometimes they didn't. Now, it's actually quite interesting that this is what Piacenza does, because it's one of the very first cities in Italy to use an accurate tax measurement, an estimo, for its core taxation, already in the 1160s. That can be used to argue that Piacenza is one of Italy's more precociously organized communes, and indeed it was. But we've also got later documents from the city that show that paying the estimo was a privilege reserved to citizens. And certainly in the countryside before 1184, you don't have any reference to an estimo for Piacenza, far from it. Here, exacting tax was often more like arbitrary requisition in wartime, taking booty. That's a very simple way of expressing power by force, although at the expense of gaining any consensus. And it's also the opposite of being routinized. I mean, a small handful of men can exact taxation, but you need an army detachment to grab pledges on this scale. I mean, obviously, nobody ever pays tax willingly. But it's new in this period, so especially unwelcome, and it's very capricious. So here, communal power is felt simply to be an arbitrary and external imposition with no system. Now, that sense of city power as not just an external imposition, but an unwelcome one, extends to justice. The development of urban judicial power in both of the contadi, Pavia and Piacenza, the requirement to do justice not only before city officials, but also routinely in the city, has got an analogous pacing to swearing in consuls and taxation. But in these 5 villages, city communal justice doesn't always feel like a normal process. It's often simply depicted as people being forced to go into the city by nuntii because a citizen or a neighbor has raised a plea against them. And witnesses are similarly constrained to go into the city. And city criminal justice, which is more often done on the spot, is frequently seen as imposed. So when Ottolino di Alda of Pieve Parpanese killed his neighbor Gualterino Mormanno, probably shortly before 1184, one witness stated that a consul of Piacenza came to take pledges to do justice from Ottolino's brother Uberto, as Ottolino had fled. Uberto said he didn't owe them because he's not from Piacenza's contado, And anyway, the killing is part of a feud, so not really the city's business. So the consul, who clearly disagreed, simply broke into his strong box, which Uberto kept in the local church, broke the lock, took its contents, and left. Uberto only ever got part of that back. The fact is, prior to this, justice was essentially local. It was in the hands of village notables or else lords, and had been for centuries. So when cities started to demand that a range of cases be heard in the city before city consuls, peasants and other villagers were not grateful. City judges took it for granted that their justice was more professional than and superior to that of rural amateurs and of lords who couldn't judge against themselves. Historians have often believed them. But from the peasant standpoint, the norms of justice are being taken away from them and people they knew and handed over to strangers who might judge by different rules and whom they couldn't influence. And of course, cities are not close. Piacenza's 20 to 25 kilometers away, Pavia 25 to 30 across a large river. Not huge distances, but a long day's walk. And hearings don't necessarily end in a single day. They involve time and expense, which is another burden. Making that normal is a long and slow process. So that's what the conquest of the contado meant to villagers. It's far from heroic when seen from the countryside. It involved the imposition of new and unwelcome burdens, almost random taxation and city-based justice, neither more obviously milder or better than what was there before. And urban power is at least as pervasive and locally interfering. Villagers actually benefited from city power on relatively few occasions. Notably, when grain is scarce, they get it from both cities, or when they fled war to one city or the other. Now, it's not that these villages don't recognize urban authority at all. Almost all villagers are at least implicitly supporters of one side or another. They don't see themselves as autonomous. They say things like, we are more of Pavia than Piacenza, or vice versa. In Monticelli, they said to a consul of Pavia, we are very surprised, Valde Miramur, that you let us be forced by the men of Piacenza, as we are yours, vestri sumus. In Olmo, when men from Olubra came to buy goods, the men of Olmo demanded to be paid in Pavese and not Piacentino money, quote, since I want to spend it in terra mea, since I am of the terra of Pavia. But that doesn't mean they appreciate the exercise of urban power. They're a bit like the Italian cities facing Barbarossa. They might be he might be legally in the right, but he took too much and too arbitrarily. Now, obviously, these villages didn't have any hope of resistance, and they knew it. Actual violence is seldom involved. But cities are going to win out in the end. But the other point is, winning out's not enough. I've implied already, arbitrary power is simple, armed men taking things from villages, no need for calculations of rights. But it involved more people, more work, because consensus isn't achieved. City communes have armed forces, obviously, they use them all the time, but they can't intimidate every village in a contado at once. The key challenge is to gain consent and to regularize. Peasants greatly valued regularization in their obligations so that they could plan ahead. An intelligent city leader knew that governing with consent was cheaper if it could be achieved. So in Lucca, for example, in Tuscany, which had a notably high level of consent in the part of its contado which it controlled fully, about half the old diocese, our evidence from court proceedings shows that already in the later 12th century, a single minor city official could make court decisions real in the countryside. Piacenza hadn't reached this point yet. The routinization of power was the essential next step, but it hasn't yet come. Now, moving to Rome. The picture of rural reactions to city power presented by the 1184 case is normal, in my view, for late 12th century Italy. That's how cities began to extend their authority everywhere, effortfully and in fairly arbitrary and unroutinized ways. But it's not normal in Rome. This city is a clear, illuminating exception. And that's what I want to talk about for the rest of the paper. Rome doesn't have any court cases as revealing as the one we've just had, but we've got some useful data all the same. We don't have much of a peasant voice when we look at the impact of Rome on the countryside. In all our texts from this period, peasants only clearly speak once, in a set of witnessing dating to 1201. And here they're not talking directly about the city, but it is worth starting from here. The text is significant in other ways. The case here, it's heard by judges appointed by the Pope, is between two lords, both of them Roman churches, the monastery of San Ciriaco in Vialata and the Basilica of San Paolo fuori le mura. It related to rights over a huge area of land called Silva Maior and Reatina on the edge of the Agro Romano. It's an area of land clearance, and unlike the rest of the Agro Romano, where settlement is dispersed, as I've said, Silva Maior actually had villages, Pilorotto, Monte del Sorbo, Torricella. The dispute began because San Ciriaco had ceded away many of the monastery's rights to take rents and dues from peasants there to a local family of aristocrats, the Ottaviani, the head of which, Giovanni of Monte Albano, had died without heirs in 1199 and willed his lands to San Paolo. San Ciriaco therefore had to argue that this cession was temporary and could not be alienated, and that anyway, the monastery had continued to collect some of the rents alongside the Ottaviani, and so had not given up its possession. It won the case, in fact, so its arguments were accepted in court. But the witnessing, all in support of San Ciriaco, because we don't have the other side, is anyway more interesting for us. So a man called Bentivoglio, the most detailed witness, had worked the land while young, parvulus, paying rent to San Ciriaco, and had more recently seen the Ottaviani violently seize, as he says, goods from people, and also get nominally voluntary gifts, quote, as the more powerful are accustomed to extort from the weak, unquote. They tried to take a mule from him as well, but he himself was by now powerful, potens, and he and his friends fought them off. Now, this Bentivoglio had risen in the world. He starts as a cultivator, but he's now locally influential, but he's still local. Here, in his pro-San Ciriaco version, the arbitrary local figures are lords, not the city. But the city commune does appear as a judge, entirely neutrally. An appeal had been made to Benedetto Carusomo, senator of Rome in 1191-3, and he had instructed the local justiciar of Tivoli to ensure that San Ciriaco kept its legitimate wood rights in Silva Maior. So the city commune had heard the case, or part of it, in 1191-3. The Pope and his officials heard it in 1201. I said earlier, Rome has a dual justice system, both papal and communal. Here, however, it seems to have hardly mattered which one heard the case. Both were appealed to at different stages. But there's anyway no resistance to city judicial interventions here. Both versions of city justice are routine. Now, we don't have surviving documents for peasant pleas to any communal or papal court in the 12th century in Rome. In fact, they're rare anywhere in Italy. The only disputes that survive in which peasants may have been plaintiffs, all for vineyard areas near the city, were settled by agreed arbiters, not any formal court. Arbiters are cheaper than formal courts, particularly in Rome, where justice seems to be unusually expensive. But it's worth noting that one of these arbiters in 1168 actually involved a Roman senator operating as the arbiter. There was a hint here of a certain routine in settling disputes. But perhaps the best evidence we've got in Rome for rural routine comes from an unusual source, the judicial documents of the Salt Guild, for which we have half a dozen from the 12th century and early 13th. Rome's salt pans are well out of the city at the mouth of the Tiber. Some were beside what is now Fiumicino Airport. The others are across the river at Ostia. They're among the largest in Italy, and they're better documented than any others, except those around Venice. The salt bands themselves were, as usual, very much under the control of Roman churches and aristocrats. But the Schola Salinariorum was a guild which linked urban middlemen, often elite status, middling elite status, and the salt workers themselves. Here it's normal for both churches and quite ordinary laymen to appeal to this court, which had a semi-public status. And I think that's significant, and I would argue that normality probably also extended to the communal court of the Roman Senate itself when it came in. Now, what's the impact of the city of Rome in the countryside in other respects? As I've said, the whole of the Agro Romano is owned by the city. All agricultural rents go to the city. Peasants pay rents in produce in all our documented examples. Wine and garden produce in the belt of vineyards and orti around the city. Wine again in the hill slopes below Albano, then as now a major vineyard area, salt from the Tiber mouth, grain in the rest of the Agro Romano, which was not until the later Middle Ages, the great zone of pasture land celebrated in the paintings of Claude Lorrain, which I can't avoid just giving you a nice picture of, slightly fuzzy, but sorry about that. But Rome as a city could live off all of this directly. Only animals for meat and leather came in from elsewhere. The city could simply be seen as a collective landlord in this very wide area, one so encompassing that we don't know in any detail where peasants lived. In this area, Rome is absolutely central and dominant. And there are almost no local players of any significance. There could not be rural communes when there aren't even villages. We only find them or their equivalents in some exceptional places, such as Ostia, by now just a village. In documents of 1159, Ostia's collectivity of conchives, with 64 names listed, so certainly peasants as well as local elites, made a deal with the Pope over wood dues, wood payments at the end of a dispute. In fact, that's the most detailed example we've got of systematic rural protagonism in the face of the city. But the only centre to defy Rome systematically in the Agro Romano was Tuscolo, but that's certainly not a peasant choice. Rather, it's because Tuscolo was the political centre of one of Rome's oldest and most powerful families. The ancestors of the Tuscolani had indeed ruled Rome itself in the early 10th century. Rome constantly attacked Tuscolo back, destroyed it utterly in 1191, to the great benefit of modern archaeologists. But in the rest of the Agro Romano, peasants were silent, and as I said, we don't even know where they lived. Further out from the Agro Romano, centres like Nepi, Sutri, Civita Castellana, Terracina, and above all Tivoli are more coherent as political centres. Nepi had consuls by 1131, Sutri by 1179, Terracina in the late 12th. They're certainly directly subject to Rome, always have been, but they have their own local authority as well. But here it's harder to say that we're talking of peasant activity. These were cities, even though very small ones, not as small as Ostia, but small, own bishops. They certainly had their own military elites. And in Nepi, in fact, the phrase used in our single source for Nepi's consuls, which is an inscription citing the consular oath, actually refers to them as milites et consules. Tivoli certainly operates as a collectivity, defying Rome, defeating its army in 1141. Although it's defeated back in 1143, it gained generous terms from Innocent II, which is indeed one of the sparks that set off the revolt of the Commune of Rome in the same year. And that resistance almost certainly had a peasant component, but Tivoli is more of an urban centre than any of the other places I've mentioned. It would be hard to argue for an autonomous peasant protagonism here. So for the most part, what we've got for the wide lands around Rome is not direct evidence for the reactions of the huge peasant majority to city government. All that we can say is that city government seems to have been routine and normal and seen as such, much more routine than that of Piacenza for the peasants who lived on Piacenza's borderlands. But that we can say that, even tentatively, is important, because that normality is the best guide that we have to the degree to which Rome's government was accepted, taken for granted in the hinterland both its narrower hinterland, the Agro Romano, and its wider hinterland. And I propose that this is because Rome was one of the few cities in Italy whose political and even institutional centrality wasn't really ever contested in the lands around it from Sutri to Terracina, even during the crisis of city government around 1100, and certainly not after the appearance of the Roman commune in the 1140s. And above all, alternative powers are entirely lacking in the Agro Romano, except for Tuscolo. It's particularly the case that territorial lordships are absent in this substantial area as well. Now, outside the Agro Romano, signorie territoriali and their private justice were absolutely standard, and bad behavior by lords became more common after 1100 in particular, but the weight of the city is never called into question. To repeat, the only major center that resisted Rome in the 12th century, and thus would have disagreed here, was Tivoli. But Rome, despite its double government, probably had in institutional terms the strongest power and over an unusually large hinterland of any city in communal Italy in this period. Only Milan, not by chance as yet the only city in mainland Italy which was larger than Rome, could match it before 1200 inside its own single diocese, which is a rather smaller territory. And even Milan took some time in the last third of the 12th century to create the institutional normality, which Rome seems to have had all along. But there's one relative absence in Rome, and it's a substantial and intriguing one, and that's taxation. We've seen that cities in northern Italy routinely took taxes from peasants. And then the arbitrary pledges as well. These existed in most cities by the 1160s. There are also tolls on commerce, indirect taxes. These are often said to have been larger scale than the land taxes that peasants paid. I think in practice that varied between cities. But the land taxes are, of course, those that most affected the peasant majority. They're the cause of very great friction between city and countryside, as we've seen, because they're the most visible sign of what peasants see as city oppression. But around Rome, they're simply absent. Rome took tolls on goods going into the city, always had done. It profited from justice, and perhaps above all, from the 1250s at the latest, it profited from tolls on the salt production of Ostia and Porto, which are the most substantial in central Italy, and they're going a long way. There's absolutely no sign of any land tax, whether regular or arbitrary, on the lands around the city. We've got hardly even the vaguest hint of one until the end of the 13th century, when we get indications of a focaticum, a hearth tax, plus a tax in units of salt and a tax to pay the army. The Commune of Rome seems previously to have relied on tolls and judicial dues to pay its very numerous officials. It's true that a fixed sum in fodrum was expected from every new castle, which agreed to be subject to the Roman Church, particularly in the late 12th century and onwards. But we don't have very much indication of its scale in this period. And also, it seems, as far as I can tell, to have only appeared outside the lands which always looked to Rome, from Sutri to Terracina. So in Marco Venditelli's important study of Sutri, the issue of direct taxation simply doesn't appear, hardly. Tolls on the road that runs through it, the Great Pilgrim Road to Rome, but that's it. When we do get indications of the scale of this set of taxes, and the earliest lists I've seen are for 1298, as late as that, they're all exacted in lump sums, effectively in tribute, from the castelli of the by now substantial region dominated by Rome, mostly some way from the city. Only it's as late as these 1360s that we see the tax in salt being exacted from castles closer to Rome, around the Agro Romano, which the city had always controlled. And even then, not in the Agro Romano itself. Now, that may be the fault of our evidence. Already in 1299, Monte del Sorbo, one of the villages in Silva Mayor, is stated in a document to be exempt from taxation because it had fewer than 12 families living there. So it's quite likely that by the 1290s, the Agro Romano only didn't pay in taxes because villages are almost absent in the area of the Casali, and because their total populations were very small. And that this de facto division between Casali, which are not taxed, and Castelli, which paid lump sums, extended throughout Rome's widest territory by then, by the very end of the 13th century. But that's a century later, more than a century later in most cases, than taxation started in any city further north. And the lack of information in our sources doesn't give a sense that it was ever something that people fought over. Now, it's hardly surprising that we don't get very much evidence of rural communities resenting the city if the major element in that resentment further north was absent for the first century of the Roman commune and more. Now, there are certainly uncertainties here. This is a surprisingly unstudied topic. More work needs to be done, among other things, to separate out papal incomings and communal incomings, particularly after the Pope's return to Rome in 1188. And how the commune paid for its substantial expenditures, starting with building its ambitious Palazzo Comunale on what's now the Piazza del Campidoglio, already in the mid-12th century, the first in Italy. But particularly in the early 13th century, when the popes had returned and taken back many of the rights which the commune had occupied for 40 years, it's quite unclear how they managed to do this. But it's at least clear that taxation is not a political issue in the relationship between Rome and its contado, even beyond the Agro Romano, stretching out to centers like Sutri. And that's very important, because it's a political issue everywhere else in communal Italy, involving city officials, rural lords, and the peasantry as a key element in their reactions to city power. It contributed, in my view in particular, to the sense that Rome's dominance is seen by the inhabitants of its large contado as routine, regular, not necessary to try to defy or protest against. Because the most arbitrary element of urban power in northern Italy, taxation, is simply not there to be defied. So I'm concluding here. I've been stressing an opposition between arbitrary and routinized power here, because it's routinization which made the wider rule of cities and their communes properly solid. This is, for me, a more important process than the other more famous markers of communal development in the 13th century, such as podestà, legislation, the rise of the popolo. Routinization of power, however, had one crucial spin-off. It was less work. It was not necessary to use consuls and armed detachments to make the point about swearing in village leaders, taxation, army service every year. Ordinary officials in ones and twos could do it. People got used to it. Now, the routinization of power is not a one-way process in medieval Italy. Many cities found that it would lose coherence. They would lose coherence in later centuries, and then effortfully that routinization had to be established again. There's a lot of work in the 14th and 15th centuries about that. But one thing seems to me clear: Rome managed it earlier than Piacenza, and indeed than almost any other city. Now, Rome's no longer regarded as an outlier in its overall communal development in the 12th century. But I think we have to recognize that the effective power the city had over its unusually large hinterland was also unusually great in the 12th century, and also with changes for some time after. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. That really fascinating lecture, which leaves me feeling great sympathy for the poor peasantry who are sort of shunted from pillar to post in this confusing but it was incredibly exciting to hear from them directly. We do have some time for questions. If we take questions from the hall, although we can all hear each other perfectly, you do need to use a roving microphone so that people listening from home can also hear you. We're just fetching the microphone, and then we'll start with you, John.
Thank you, Chris, for a lovely talk. I'm just wondering if one of the factors that might explain why the situation in Rome is different from that in Piacenza is that in Piacenza, it's just developing in the 12th century, but in Rome, it may have been normalized already for some centuries. I'm thinking to things like the 942 Placitum, in which Alberic and others sort out property dispute in Tivoli. So, I mean, do you think there was any sense that this had been the way that they'd been doing it for long enough that it was now accepted as a norm?
Yeah, I think in part that really is the case. That there is that there's a solidity to Roman power in the 10th century. It goes away a bit in the late 11th. I think that the hiatus of the Civil War period between 1080s and 1110s is actually, I mean, that's a generation of it not working in the same way. And I think that that's long enough for people to lose the sense of it. But I think that issue of landowning is, however, crucial because the people who own land around Rome, they never forget that. Those rents are still coming in. And the other thing is that the popes do not forget that they did indeed used to rule a much wider area. And so they've got an ambition, and they can draw on that because although people are used to being more autonomous than they were, they do know in the back of their mind that there is a papal authority here. In the same way as cities know in northern Italy in the back of their mind that Frederick Barbarossa is actually legally in the right. And so, well, obviously the popes are more successful than Barbarossa is. But these kinds of memories do matter, at least in the minds of city rulers themselves. I'm not sure what the Piacentini think about. I think they do think they have rights over their entire contado, but how those rights had been exercised previously is a lot vaguer.
Yes.
And all the evidence we've got for how urban government works in the 10th, 11th centuries, it doesn't really affect villages. And I think you're right that there is a difference there.
Thank you.
Other questions in the room? Yes.
Your sources for Piacenza are published, or?
The big court case is published.
Sorry?
The big court case is published.
I see.
A problem about Piacenza is that the archive that the largest archive that has communal documents, which is the archive of Sant'Antonino, is not published and actually not that easy to get into. It's not impossible, but it's not that easy. And I haven't done it. In part, I haven't done it because someone's doing a doctoral thesis on this, and I didn't want to step on her toes. But I don't think, from what I've read about Piacenza, that Sant'Antonino would tell us a lot more about these particular villages. It would be nice if they did, but I don't think it does.
Thank you.
Cafe up in the bar back, right?
Thank you very much. A question about routinization. And since it's a little bit like the dog that doesn't bark, I'm wondering what the parameters are that for you constitute the opposite of routinization.
Well, I think, well, the best example I've got is it taking tax in an arbitrary way. And the sense of these people are just going to turn up and you don't know what they're going to demand. You don't know what they're going to take. You can't predict. And you know what you're supposed to pay, but that's not what they take. That's not routinized. And I think that at the end of the 13th century, by and large, in city territories, whether city power is strong or weak, and it's sometimes strong and it's sometimes a lot weaker, but you know what the city is going to do. So in Siena, for example, which I looked at, rural communes know when city officials are going to turn up. They know what the city is going to ask them for, not in fact a lot, but it's expected, and there are certain rights that they have which they know they have. They know the city knows they have, which can certainly be exercised in a tyrannical way. But I think the point here is, obviously, powerful people behave badly in every period. Powerful people are capable of being arbitrary in every period, but there are some periods where it's a lot less surprising that they do that than others. And it's when you can say you're behaving in an unfair way. You're not supposed to do it like this. And then city officials can have a choice as to whether to say, well, stuff you, I'm going to do it anyway, or to say, oh, well, yeah, maybe you're right. But in the late 12th century, that's not a dialogue that you're going to have with the city. The city is just going to come and take it.
I mean, I think that you're going back and forth in the answer between unfair and arbitrary is very interesting and a little slippery, because one could imagine if routinization has to do with the reactions of the population, then even arbitrary action, if done over and over again, will produce routinization. It's not about fairness.
Indeed, that's quite right. And if it's done in exactly the same way, then it's routinized. But if you don't know how much they're going to take, then it's not routinized. I mean, one thing that peasants do all the way across Western Europe in the 12th century is they cut deals with lords, called franchises, or franchigie in Italian, in which lords say, this is what we're going to take. And the peasants pay quite a lot of money for the assurance from the lord that they're going to take that and nothing else. But because the peasants want to know what it's going to be. You don't do franchise deals with cities. But cities have a kind of parallel to that realization, which is, and I think it's simply, cities know that if they want to be arbitrary, they're going to have to send a lot more armed men than if they're not going to be arbitrary. And I'm quite struck by the fact that in some cities in Lucca in the late 12th century, in Pistoia in the early 13th, you've got accounts of people going and doing justice in villages with just themselves and maybe a couple of other people. People don't resist because they know what they're going to get. But if they'd just gone in there and taken things, it would have needed more men. So I think that's one of the differences. The image of fairness, you're quite right, is different from the image of being arbitrary. But they certainly use, I mean, when lords concede the end of taking arbitrary dues from peasants in these franchigie, they use the word bad. These are bad exactions. And there's an imagery of, we're going to use the word bad when we're going to give this, we're going to give our rights away. But there's clearly, I mean, it's interesting, they use the word malus. There's a moral edge to it. It's not just neutral taking stuff.
Can I just jump in with a question in relation to that? Because I keep thinking about the other side, about the perceived benefit. You mentioned in the Piacenza Pavia standoff that one of the questions was, where did you flee when you needed refuge? And in the Roman case, presumably the benefit of being part of that really long established conurbation in some way is a given. Yeah. Even if it's not actual, it's a perceived given. And so I wonder about, what does the peasant stand to get from I mean, surely there must be some quid pro quo, or is it just arbitrary taxation?
Well, it's difficult to tell, to be honest, but particularly it's difficult to tell in the Roman case. And once you get into the 30th century, which I wasn't really talking about, then you've got to deal with the fact that Piparoni have got a very, very considerable power in their local castles, and what they say goes, even though they're paying taxes to Rome. Now, what peasants think about that, we actually don't know, but it's hard to imagine that they would be keen. Actually, we do have one or two instances of them abandoning villages in order to avoid this, and so they're not keen, but you wouldn't expect them to be keen. But the advantage of Piacenza, I mean, it is true, people do flee to cities during war, in wartime, and there are moments at which there are famines and peasants are fed from the city, but it's much less common. And maybe in the end, people value city justice. That's hard to tell. I would be prepared to say firmly you can't see it in the 12th century, but in the 13th maybe you can see it. But it's difficult to get at the individual reactions of peasants. I've given you the best I've given you the best that I can, but I think. I mean, it's part of that routinization again, I think.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yes, all right.
Just picking on something up that you said at the end, where you were suggesting that thinking about routinization is perhaps a more useful thing to be thinking about than the things that we often focus on about the rise of city power, podestà, popolo, and so on. When going on, when those things start happening, how does that affect your story, or is there too much else going on in between, too many other interruptions? Once we, for example, the rise of regimes of the popolo and the disenfranchisement of many of the urban aristocrats and so on, how does that start to affect this? Especially because, as you said, many of the people that live in the cities are themselves rural landowners. So does that start to change this process, or has too much else changed as well by then?
It does. I mean, everything that you ever read about city communes changes the process somehow. The way that cities configure themselves changes. The popolo have different views as to what's an acceptable way of running the countryside. Tendentially they're more hostile to territorial lordships, because many of the territorial lords are their enemies inside the city. Whether the popolo has any feeling for peasants is a matter of, I mean, I think I would rather doubt it. They're too urban to have any feeling for peasants. But the work actually hasn't been done. That's one of the troubles. You go into the 13th century, the work hasn't really been done as to what how peasant reactions are configured. I think that would be very interesting work to do. I mean, it changes again with the rise of territorial states. It changes again with the end of communes with the end of communal self-government. These things also change. But one of the interesting things about the 14th and 15th centuries is there's quite a lot of work now done, particularly in Lombardy, about the way that cities, that the impact of cities on the countryside is much weaker at certain moments in the 14th and 15th century than it seems to be in the 13th. And that's interesting in itself. But these studies, interestingly, don't talk a lot about tax. Tax carries on being taken. Justice carries on being done in ways that seem to be much less controversial. And I think that's interesting. So the configurations have changed, but some of that routinization, I think, has stayed the same.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. I sense that people need to wet their whistles.
I do for sure.
And Chris certainly does. So that was fantastic. That was a really, really interesting and delightfully delivered lecture. Thank you so much. Please do join us upstairs for a drink.